Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining. My name is David Nathaniel. I'm the president of the community of Babylonian Iraqi Jews in Montreal. And in association with the Spanish and Portuguese Synagogue located here in Montreal, we're honored to have Jonathan Kaufman, the author of The Last Kings of Shanghai book, join us to present on his book and to take questions and answers, as well as to hear comments from the audience. I'd like to thank our co-sponsors, which are the Babylonian Jewry Heritage Center in Israel, the Babylonian Jewish Center in New York, the Sephardi community in London, England, and Dangur Education, also based out in London, England. So we're very excited to have Jonathan with us. We have a worldwide audience from Canada, of course, the US, from the UK, parts of Europe and Israel. So thank you all for attending and for joining us. It's an honor to have you here. So if you have, as we go through the schedule, we're going to have a few introductions, followed by Jonathan's presentation, followed by questions and answers. So as well as if you haven't purchased the book, or if you want to purchase the book after this presentation, you're more than welcome to. It's available on Amazon, and so easy enough for you to access it. So on that note, I'd like to introduce the president of the Spanish and Portuguese Synagogue in Montreal, Charles Shemy, to say a few words.
Hi, everyone. My name is Charles Shemy. I am the president of the Spanish and Portuguese Synagogue in Montreal, and I'm very excited to hold this event. We have a lot of participants. There are 95 people right now from pretty much from all over the world, as David said. And it's very exciting to have this conversation with Jonathan Kaufman regarding his book, The Last Kings of Shanghai. And it really hits home to the Iraqi community. And I'm very excited to hear how this conversation transpires. I also want you to know that basically the Spanish and Portuguese in Montreal has a lot of events that are ongoing, and we'd like you to get involved, and and everything is pretty much for free. And also I would like to thank David Nathaniel for organizing this event. It's a big task, and so thank you very much, David, for doing this. Thank you for everybody.
Thank you very much, Charles. So we're going to start with just a few pictures that I want to share with you that we've been able to get a hold of, and I will show you this. First of all, a lot of this was provided by the Babylonian Jewish Heritage Center, which is based in Or Yehuda, Israel. As you can see, they have a beautiful building. Looks like paradise almost to me. I've been to the old one, but I haven't been to this one, so I'm definitely due. And so they shared a few pictures. One of them being the Sifrei Torah of the Sassoon family, which they have on display at the Heritage Center. As well, they shared a photo of the prisoner camp that was located in the northwest part of Shanghai. It was primarily there to hold British and American subjects, but amongst those people were roughly 70 Jews from the Baghdadi community in Shanghai who were arrested at that time. And then as well, there's a photo of the synagogue in Shanghai, the Ohel Rachel Synagogue, as well. And then finally, David Dangur was kind enough to, sorry, just waiting to change, 1 second. Oops, excuse me. Yes, and David Dangur was kind enough to share a photo of his grandparents and his mom and her siblings, and so he explained that his mother Renee was born in Shanghai, and she lived there until she was 20. And her father, who you can see in the photo, was the head of the Shanghai Community Organization at that time. So with no further ado, I'd like to introduce Rabbi Maiman Pinto from the Spanish and Portuguese in Montreal, and he will give a few words and then introduce Jonathan Kaufman. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Charles. Thank you, everyone, for joining us here for this presentation. The idea of inviting Mr. Jonathan Kaufman as a guest speaker was first brought up during a conversation I had with David Nathaniel, our executive vice president of the Spanish and the president of the community of Babylonian Iraqi Jews of Montreal. David enthusiastically told me about the great book he was reading by the name of The Last Kings of Shanghai. The last who, I asked? The last king of Shanghai, came the answer on the other side of the line. And to be quite frank, it sounded a bit too romantic for my taste, but it really piqued my curiosity. After that conversation, I looked up the book online, I read the reviews and about the author. The following week at our cigars and scotch Torah talk that we held at the synagogue, I asked some of the gentlemen present if they heard of the book, and our treasurer, Ron Mashal, told me that he was in the middle of reading it. And what do you know, the next week, Ron gave me a copy, and I ordered a few copies that were offered to some of you present here today. The story of the Sassoon and Kaduri family is inspiring to me on many levels, but most importantly, how they, through the challenges, they always stay true to their identity and their people. And David and I spoke about inviting Jonathan Kaufman, that we wanted to share this beautiful story and our read of the book. And so we were fortunate enough to get a hold of Jonathan Kaufman. After a few attempts, we finally got a hold of him, and we made this happen. And David organized and took it from there. Jonathan Kaufman is a Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter, was written and reported in China for 30 years for the Boston Globe, where he covered the 1989 massacre in Tiananmen Square, the Wall Street Journal, where he served as China bureau chief from 2002 to 2005, and Bloomberg News. He is the author of A Hole in the Heart of the World, Being Jewish in Eastern Europe, and Broken Alliance. The Turbulent Times Between Black and Jews in America, winner of the National Jewish Book Award. He is director of the School of Journalism at Northeastern University in Boston, and of course, the author of The Last Kings of Shanghai. We are privileged and honored to have him here with us today. The floor is all yours, Jonathan.
Thank you very much, Rabbi. Thank you. I want to thank everyone, I guess, all around the world for joining this afternoon. This is really a treat for me, in part because while I've spoken a lot about the book since it came out, the audiences typically are either American Jews who are mostly from Europe originally or from Russia, also speaking to Jews in Britain and in Israel. The chance to speak to a group of Jews who trace their families back to Iraq means a great deal to me, and I think gives me a chance to talk about some of the unique aspects of this story, which not only affects China, but also affects the history of Jews everywhere. My interest in this topic really began when I was a very young reporter. I was right out of university, And I was traveling in China back in the late 1970s. And this was back when China was Red China. It was still very influenced by the communists. Mao had died only recently, a few years before I got there. Everybody was walking around in their Mao jackets and their Mao caps. There were far more bicycles than cars on the street. And I was walking along the main road in Shanghai, the Bund that runs along the waterfront, and I had to use the bathroom. So I stepped into a hotel, and it was like walking into a 1930s movie set. The floors were marble. There were these beautiful crystal chandeliers, stained glass windows, and a bellhop all dressed in white with a little white cap came up to me. And when I asked him in English where the bathroom was, he responded to me in French. So I was trying to figure out this, where did this place come from, this anachronism in the middle of Shanghai that looked like it belonged in a Hollywood movie set from the 1930s. And then someone told me that this had been the hotel built by Victor Sassoon, who was a millionaire playboy who had lived in Shanghai in the 1920s and 1930s. So I filed that away the way reporters often do when you kind of find an interesting fact. And then on a subsequent trip, I was invited to go visit what they called the Children's Palace. And the Children's Palace was a kind of a place where families in Shanghai would bring their kids on weekends for music lessons, ballet lessons, violin lessons, things like that. So I decided to go. I thought it might make a fun feature story. And when I got there, again, it was this wildly strange place. It looked like an English country house right in the middle of Shanghai, like something out of Downton Abbey or something like that. And I went inside, and there were, in fact, Chinese children taking their music lessons in these various rooms. But the ballroom, where there were several classes going on, was about the size of an American football field. There were chandeliers, beautiful chandeliers hanging from the ceiling. There were beautiful staircases that swept up to the second floor to these ornate bedrooms. This had clearly been a mansion that had been lived in by an extraordinarily wealthy family at one point. And as I left, I noticed a small little plaque by the front door. And it said this had once been the home of the Kadoorie family. Well, I knew the Kadoories because I was living in Hong Kong as a foreign correspondent at the time. And the Kadoories were very well known in Hong Kong. They owned the Peninsula Hotel. They owned the power company. They were incredibly powerful. And they were also the major supporters of the Jewish community. When I had gone to high holiday services in Hong Kong, people had whispered and pointed out the Kadoories when they showed up for services, because they were both the biggest benefactors of the Hong Kong Jewish community, and also had this remarkable connection with China. Years later, when I was actually based in Beijing with my family and our 3 kids, the kids always loved going to Shanghai. It was a great adventure for them. They loved exploring it. And so we were out one weekend walking around the city and ended up in a very poor neighborhood. And as we walked through it, I noticed that there were the shadows of mezuzahs on the doorposts of many of the tenement houses there. And again, I couldn't figure out what were these mezuzahs doing in the middle of Shanghai. But of course, it turned out that these had been left, and the shadows had been made by mezuzahs posted by some of the 18,000 Jewish refugees who had found safety in Shanghai during World War II. So all this kind of coalesced in my mind, and I thought I wanted to find out more about this story. And as an American Jew, and I trace my own family roots to Russia and to Germany, I didn't really know much about the Jews of Iraq. We grew up with the story of Fiddler on the Roof, which is the Jews who are living in ghettos and then move up in society and become very prominent. So this story started in Baghdad, and that was a part of the world that I knew very little about. I remember early on when I started my research, a Jew whose family was from Baghdad originally said to me, he said, "You will find out that the Baghdadi Jews, the Babylonian Jews, are the Jewish aristocracy, that we are smarter than all the other Jews, we are better business people than all the other Jews. We are really the very top of the top." And in many ways, I think this book has confirmed it. My journey confirmed it. As I learned about Baghdad, this was a community that traced its roots back to Jerusalem, back to the destruction of the temple, where Nebuchadnezzar had kidnapped groups of Jews and brought them to Babylon, to Baghdad. And we read about them in the Bible, in the Psalm, by the rivers of Babylon, we wept when we remembered Zion. But what became quickly clear to me is that while some Jews may have wept by the rivers of Babylon, they were doing extremely well the rest of the time. The Jewish community in Baghdad, as I'm sure many of you know, became very prominent, very successful economically, deeply involved in trade. And were really so prominent that the various rulers of Baghdad, Turks, the Ottomans, whoever was in power at the time, relied on them for economic advice, for strategic advice. They became almost the de facto Secretary of the Treasury. And the Turks would name the leading family and the leading man of that family to be the Nasi, the prince of the captivity. And whenever the Nasi was brought to meet the rulers of Baghdad, he was carried on a sedan chair through the streets of Baghdad. And everyone, Jew, Gentile, would tip their heads in respect as he passed by. So the Sassoons, by the 1700s, had become the leading family in Baghdad. They were extraordinarily wealthy and influential, not only in Iraq, but throughout the Middle East. And where my story begins is in the early 1800s, where David Sassoon was 37 years old and was about to take over the family empire and to become the leader of the Jewish community. But as often happens around the world, the politics turned against the Jews. And the Turkish rulers began to kidnap wealthy Jews and hold them for ransom to increase the flow of money to the government treasury. And so David Sassoon was put in jail. And his father hustled down to save him. He bailed him out of jail. But he realized that things were not going to go well for either him or his family or for the Jews in Baghdad. And so he hustled him down to the waterfront and put him in a ship, a boat that he had paid for, and sent him off to safety. But before he sent his son off to safety, he covered him with a cloak. And inside the cloak, he had sewn pearls and other precious gems so that David Sassoon would have something to start with when he found safety. And I guess when I look at that moment, it strikes me that this really isn't a story of Fiddler on the Roof. It's really almost a Shakespearean story. It's a story of a very wealthy, powerful family, almost royalty, that loses everything. And David Sassoon ended up spending his first night outside of Baghdad, sleeping on a warehouse floor, shooting at rats as they skittered by. It was an incredible fall from power, from influence, from wealth. And in many ways, he and his family over the next century and a half would spend all their time trying to regain that influence and regain that power. David Sassoon made his way to India, to Bombay. And there he arrived just as the British were arriving in India. This is around 1820, 1830. And the British would turn India into a colony. But they were also very welcoming to Jews and other immigrants because they wanted to increase their influence and spread their influence through business and through trade. And so they were willing to cooperate with local people or immigrants like David Sassoon, who would foster business and would sort of spread the Union Jack around the world as the British Empire expanded. David Sassoon fell in love with the British. He became an Anglophile. He himself never learned English, but he made sure that all his sons learned English. He gradually brought out his entire family from Baghdad. They settled in Bombay. And David Sassoon quickly became extremely wealthy. And he hired British tutors who would teach his sons not only English, but also British history, because he believed that Britain was the future and that the British Empire was the future. And it was important that he tie his fortunes to London and to the British. In fact, when Queen Victoria is officially named Empress of India, David Sassoon stood on the on the street with his sons, everyone dressed in their traditional Baghdadi garb, and sang "God Save the Queen" to show their loyalty. His children, in fact, began to take British names. Instead of Abdullah, they called themselves Albert. And so David Sassoon had this dream of his family becoming part of the British Empire. Now, as I said, the British were very much driven by trade. And one of the markets they wanted to crack open was China. China, then as now, is a huge market. And the major product that China was buying was opium. And I'll talk a little bit about opium and the moral questions it raises. But the lure of opium was so strong, the profits you could make were so high, that British businessmen persuaded the British government to essentially invade China to open up the Chinese market. And so in the 1830s and 1840s, there were the Opium Wars, where the British attacked China, defeated the Chinese military forces, and forced China to open up a number of cities, including Shanghai, Hong Kong, and others, where the British would be able to go and start trading with this huge Chinese market. David Sassoon had 8 sons, and he quickly began to deploy these sons across China to be his emissaries, the people who would kind of build his global empire in China. And you can just imagine what it was like. I mean, here were these young men, often leaving their wives behind in India for years at a time, showing up in Shanghai and Hong Kong, up and down the Chinese coast, to start doing business. And one of the things that David Sassoon realized was that as his business was expanding, he needed more people to staff his offices in China and in India. And he needed people he could trust. And so he came up with this remarkable idea, which were the Sassoon schools. He sent word back to Baghdad to Jewish families there and said that if you sent your teenagers, your young men, and they were almost always men, to the Sassoons in India, he would educate them. There were schools where they would be educated. He would teach them, he would apprentice them and teach them accounting and basic business skills. He would build synagogues so they would have a place to worship. He would build hospitals so they would have a place where they could be taken care of if they got sick. And he would build a Jewish cemetery so if they died, they could have a Jewish burial. And as a result, many Baghdadi families began to send their sons to India to be trained by the Sassoons. And once the Sassoons had trained them, they would then send them off to China to work for them. One of the families that the Sassoons recruited were the Kaduri family. The Kaduris were distantly related to the Sassoons. They were not as prominent, not as wealthy. And when their father died unexpectedly, the family fell on hard times. And Rina Sassoon decided that the best way the family could restore its fortunes was by putting them in the care of the Sassoons, sending them to India, where they would be able to rebuild their fortunes, send some money back home to support their mother. So she sent 4 of her sons away. The youngest was Eli Kaduri, who was only 15 years old when he left home in Baghdad. Eli Kaduri would become the founder of the Kaduri dynasty. But at 15 years old, he was sent off by his mother to Bombay. He apprenticed with the Sassoons, was sent to Hong Kong and then up the coast of China to start working. Now, the Sassoons became incredibly successful as businessmen, and they did it really by being very innovative and very entrepreneurial. I sometimes think of China back then as being like Silicon Valley today. It was a place where, young people could make a fortune very quickly. The Sassoons succeeded by focusing on the opium trade because the profits you could make in opium were enormous. China at that point, about 12% of the Chinese people were addicted to opium. To give you some sense, in the US today, perhaps 2 to 3% of Americans are addicted to opioids. And we know the kind of heartbreak and political upheaval the opioid crisis has caused, not only in the US, but around the world. Well, imagine if it were 6 times that. And this is why the Chinese had made opium illegal, had fought the British to keep it out. But now that they were being essentially colonized by the British, they had to allow the opium trade. The key then was, how did you make opium succeed as a business? And what the Sassoons did was, they were one of the first families to invest in steamships. The opium was cultivated in India and then had to be shipped to China. And typically that was done on sailing ships. But the Sassoons invested in steamships, which cut down the time, allowed them to get their opium to China much faster than their rivals. They also invested in this new technology called the telegraph. And what the telegraph allowed was that the various Sassoon sons scattered across China could communicate with each other, but also with their father back in India, about prices, about a good time to ship the opium, what were prices doing. It really gave them a huge edge business-wise. And they were so successful that by the 1860s, 1870s, they had driven out all of the other British competitors and completely dominated the opium trade. In fact, when I was able to read the business records of some of their rivals, like Jardine Matheson and others, you can see the British representatives in China writing back saying, who are these hook-nosed Jews? Who are these Jew boys who are suddenly taking over our business? You know, they're driving prices down, they're stealing our market. It was really an incredible turning of the tables, where these immigrants were becoming much more successful than the representatives of the British government and the British Empire. By 1870, the Sassoons completely dominated the opium trade. They were expanding into other areas as well. When the communists took over in 1949 and they came to Shanghai, they seized the Sassoon business records. And they were able to go over them. I was given access to them as well. And they concluded the Sassoons made probably over $1 billion, B for billion, $1 billion US in profits from the opium trade. And that money was then turned into real estate holdings, factories, and so forth. Now, the question of opium, I think, is a really complex one, and it's one that I tussled with a lot when I was writing this history. When you speak to the Sassoons today, the family descendants, they say, well, you know, people didn't know how bad opium was. It was like cigarettes. It was like alcohol. It was a vice, and we were making a business decision and taking advantage of that, but it was all legal. And they're right, opium was legal. It was taxed by the British. In fact, in Europe, in the 19th century, you could often get kind of derivatives of opium because aspirin was not widely sold. But it's also true that the Sassoons knew how dangerous opium was and how addictive it was. None of the Sassoons themselves ever used opium. When I went through their business records, they're often talking about how they've had to fire Chinese employees of theirs who have become addicted to opium and can't work anymore. There was a huge movement starting in Britain and then the United States to ban the opium trade completely. And that started in the 1870s, 1880s. And the Sassoons, who were becoming increasingly powerful in England, fought against that tooth and nail. So the truth is, you know, this was a moral compromise. I mean, the Sassoons, I think at some level understood what they were doing, but they were in the end imperialist and colonialist. We may think of them as being Jewish, but their primary identity really became as members of the British Empire, making business decisions and not acting really any differently than other British imperialists or colonialists did. And so I think that poses an interesting question for any of us about the role of Jewish values in business decisions, and does it affect how we conduct our daily lives? Obviously, we like to feel that it does, but in the Sassoons' case, they were very much in line with and in sync with their other British competitors and allies who just saw a huge market here and were determined to sell as much opium as they could. And so it reminds me of that line, I think, in Balzac, that behind every great fortune lies a great crime. And in the case of the Sassoons, the crime was opium. I want to talk a little bit about the women in these families, because when we talk about history, the role of women is often obscured. It's hard to get at. But there were two, I think, remarkable women. I talk about many more in the book, but two especially stand out. One is Flora Sassoon. Flora Sassoon is fairly well known in England. The book just came out in England. And Flora Sassoon is fairly well known as being a great hostess and benefactor and philanthropist. But she, in fact, had a history before that, which is that David Sassoon felt that after his sons had served their time in China, that they had to go to London. He felt that London was going to be the capital of global capitalism. It was the most important city in the world. And if he wanted his empire to be truly global, he would have to have his sons go there. And so he began to send his sons one after another to England, where they bought English country houses. They sent their children to Eton and on to Oxford and to Cambridge. And they began to become very close to the British aristocracy. They became friends with the Prince of Wales. They actually began to support his gambling habit. They would go on rest cures when he was trying to lose weight with him. And they very quickly became part of the British aristocracy and British society. They were given knighthoods, they were invited to grand parties. Although it's interesting, when you read the accounts of those parties, the Sassoons, when they write back to their father and their elder brother in Bombay, are saying, oh, it was a great party. The Prince of Wales stayed until 2 a.m. Everyone had a wonderful time. And then I would read the diary entries from many of the British aristocrats who had gone to these parties and who said, I would never rent out my home to these Jews. They're exotic, but they're just not our kind of people. So there was a tremendous amount of social anti-Semitism directed against the Iraqi Jews and against the Sassoons, even while the British were happy to do business with them and happy to give them business opportunities. But because all the boys, the sons of David Sassoon, were going to London, living the high life, going to Buckingham Palace, it was becoming nervous-making of who was going to run the business back in India and in China. And so the youngest brother died unexpectedly at one point, and the family was in a bit of a crisis. And Flora Sassoon, who was the wife of the brother, announced that she was going to take over the business. She would be willing to take over the business as a kind of regent for a few years until her son came of age and could, restore the role of men in the company. So her brothers-in-law thought that was a fine idea. She was just a woman. She wouldn't do very much. They could just kind of continue running things. But it turned out Flora Sassoon was an extraordinarily ambitious and effective businesswoman. She spoke several languages and had a terrific mind for business. What's interesting is that at this time, not only women couldn't vote, women in India were not even allowed to appear in public. They lived behind what was called purdah. And so Flora Sassoon began running the Sassoon businesses from her living room. But gradually she began to appear at factories and at offices. It was a little bit scandalous, but she was very effective. And at one point, much like the situation we're living through today, a plague broke out in Bombay, a bubonic plague. And the Sassoon workers were too terrified of catching the plague. They stopped showing up for work. They wouldn't show up at the factories. They wouldn't show up at the ports. And so Flora Sassoon commissioned scientists to come from England and from Europe to search for a cure. And they developed a vaccine. And in an even more extraordinary moment, Flora Sassoon insisted on getting the vaccine and being photographed with her bare arm and getting an injection so that her workers would see that the vaccine was effective, that they should get it, and that they would then feel safe returning to work, which they did. And that moment really, in many ways, saved the Sassoon companies. But her brothers-in-law began to feel jealous. They worried, they were back in London, that Flora would not be as willing to follow their edicts as they had hoped, that she was getting too headstrong. And so they essentially organized a boardroom coup that ousted her from the company. She sailed from Bombay to London, and she became a great hostess, but she never set foot in the Sassoon businesses again. A friend of mine says, she hit the bamboo ceiling. Another woman who was really interesting was Laura Kadoorie. As I'd said, Elie Kadoorie had left Baghdad at 15, arrived in China by the time he was 18, was working for the Sassoons. Very quickly realized that he could make a lot of money on his own, left the Sassoons, and began to make his fortune in Hong Kong. Was a millionaire by the time he was 30, and decided it was time to get a wife. So he sailed to London the way ambitious young men would do to try to find someone to marry, and met Laura Makata. Laura Makata was from a very prominent British Jewish family. Her family had been in London for a couple of hundred years, for about 100 years at that point, and were very prominent both in the Jewish community and in British business. The two fell in love, and Elie married Laura. And at that point, typically what would have happened was that Laura would have gotten pregnant, stayed in London, raised the children, and Elie would have gone back to China to make his fortune and then come back periodically to visit his family. But Laura was a very unusual woman. She was actually older than Elie. Her family was worried that she would be a spinster because she was actually quite old to still be single. But she loved to travel and had a much wider view of the world than many other people, certainly many other women in London at the time. So she announced that she was going to go back to China with her husband. And so the two of them sailed back to Hong Kong. She quickly had 2 children. And then, even more remarkably, she announced that she was going to travel with Elie as he traveled around China doing his business and setting up his business deals. And she kept a diary. She kept a diary for about 15 years, and reading it was just extraordinary. It was almost like watching Katharine Hepburn in The African Queen, as you see her with these 2 children and these Chinese servants. China's in the middle of civil war. There's poverty everywhere. And Laura was just exposed to all this and really, in a way, relished the adventure. But she also, I think, became the conscience of the Kadoorie family. As she traveled through China and saw the terrible poverty that the Chinese had to endure, she decided that the real key to China's development was the education of girls. Now, this is pretty extraordinary. This is in the early 1900s, but Laura began to convince her husband, Elie, to support and fund schools for girls that would educate them in China, also back in Baghdad. And she took a very active role in setting these schools up. And it was really a pioneering effort to bring education to poor Chinese girls throughout China. The family eventually settled in Shanghai, the Kadoorie family, in a beautiful house in Shanghai. And at one point there was a fire. A fire broke out in their home. Laura Kadoorie ran out, but then became convinced that the Chinese governess who she had hired to take care of her 2 sons was still inside the house, trapped in the fire. So Laura ran back inside to rescue her. It turned out the Chinese governess had come out through a different door. Laura was completely discombobulated by all the smoke. She lost her way, and she died in the house fire. Now, this was obviously a tragedy for the Kadoorie family, but what's most interesting in a way is that the Chinese were stunned by this, and they still talk about it. The idea that a wealthy British woman would run into a burning house to save a servant, a Chinese servant, was something that they found just remarkable. And I think it is a testament, obviously, not only to Laura's character, but also to the influence she would have on her family going forward, and that her memory would have. Because the Kadoories ended up, I think, being deeply influenced by Laura and by the steps she had taken to try to understand China and to try to help the Chinese. So back in London, meanwhile, the Sassoons were doing extremely well, but there was always this question of who was going to run the business back in Shanghai and in India. And then along comes Victor Sassoon. And if I'm lucky enough to ever have a movie made of this book, Victor Sassoon will certainly be the star. We're now at World War I. Victor Sassoon was a playboy. He was one of the Sassoons everyone assumed was going to spend all the money, but never make any. Even when he was at Cambridge University, he was walking around with a chorus girl on either arm. He had one of the best wine cellars in London, even though he was just a university student. And he was a bon vivant who just loved going to parties and the horse races. During World War I, he was a pilot, and his plane crashed and he was injured and he became crippled. He lost the use of his legs and had to use crutches or a wheelchair to get around. And he fell into a depression and became convinced that he would never be able to have the sort of social high life that he had had as a handsome, young, wealthy British aristocrat. And so he decided to go to India and then to China to try his hand at business there. And he turned out to be a brilliant businessman. He built the Cathay Hotel, the hotel that I visited many years later, and also began to transform Shanghai by building other buildings, factories. But even more, he basically turned Shanghai into one of the most glamorous cities in the world at the time. You know, if this were the 1930s and we were coming out of the pandemic, now we're all sitting around talking about all the ways in which the places we'll go, the cities we want to visit now that the pandemic is ending. Well, if this were the 1930s, Shanghai would have been at the top of our list. Shanghai had this exotic feel to it. It was exciting. It was slightly risque. Charlie Chaplin began to visit Shanghai and Victor Sassoon. Noel Coward stayed at Victor Sassoon's hotel and wrote Private Lies in a suite there. Wallace Simpson, who would make the King of England leave his throne a few years later, was photographed in Shanghai nude, except she was wearing a life jacket. I mean, that gives you a feel for what Shanghai was like. And so celebrities, wealthy people from all around the world began to stop in Shanghai as part of the world tour. And Victor Sassoon was at the center of this. He would have these extraordinary parties, costume balls at the Cathay Hotel, where he would dress up as the ringmaster, and all the guests would have to dress up as circus acts. He would dress up as the schoolmaster, and everyone had to dress up as children. It was just a nonstop a whirl of excitement and of parties. At one point, I was able to visit Victor Sassoon's suite. He built a suite on the top of the Cathay Hotel where he would live, and it was overlooking his, Shanghai empire. And so when I was there and they were taking me through it, I stepped into the bathroom and it was beautiful, but there were two bathtubs there. And I turned to the Chinese fellow taking me around and I said, "Why are there two bathtubs?" And he looked a little embarrassed and he said, Victor Sassoon always said he never minded sharing his bed, but he didn't like sharing his bath. So that gave you an idea of what it was like to be Victor Sassoon in Shanghai in the 1920s and the 1930s. But starting in the late 1930s, different kinds of people start coming on these cruise ships coming from Europe. These are Jewish refugees. The Nazis had taken over. They had invaded and taken over Austria. And the Jews in Europe were desperate to get out. And as we know, all around the world, the gates were being shut. Jews were not allowed into the US, into Britain, anywhere. These Jewish refugees were trapped. But because Shanghai was in part occupied by the British, in part by the Germans, in part by the French, in part by the Americans, there was really no functioning government in Shanghai. And that meant you didn't need a visa to enter. So if you were a Jewish refugee and could get to Shanghai, you would be safe. They had to admit you and they couldn't throw you out. So word of this spread throughout Europe, and thousands of Jewish, German and Austrian Jews primarily began to sell their belongings. These were mostly middle-class Jews, professors, merchants, lawyers, shop owners, who sold everything they had to book passage on these ships that were then leaving often from Italy and making their way to Shanghai. And again, it's hard to imagine what it was like for these middle-class Jews who had been prominent in Berlin and Vienna, suddenly discovering themselves on a ship about to get off in Shanghai. They didn't speak any Chinese. No one in Shanghai spoke any English. There was terrible poverty, absolute chaos as they came off these ships with their families. But the Kadoories and the Sassoons really stepped forward. And it's interesting, Eli Kadoorie was the first to recognize, with many of the other Baghdadi Jewish families who had settled in Shanghai, the need to help these refugees. Remember, these were businessmen. They weren't social service workers. They were businessmen. But they felt that as Jews, they had to step forward and begin to help these refugees who were coming by the thousands every month. But they were feeling overwhelmed. They would make appeals to the rest of the world and other Jewish organizations to help them, but they would get these responses from American Jews and others saying, well, we hear how rich you Baghdadi Jews are in Shanghai. You take care of your own problem. So at one point, Eli Kadoorie made his way to the Cathay Hotel to meet with Victor Sassoon. Victor Sassoon had not gotten involved in the refugee question. His own feelings about his Judaism were ambivalent, I think. He was far more likely to give money to build a synagogue than to ever set foot in one. He really saw himself as British. He had been knighted. He really, being Jewish was not a key part of his identity, although obviously the history and the values were something he was very aware of, but he also sometimes made fun of. But Eli Kadoorie, who was a much more serious man, he was never invited to Victor Sassoon's parties. He wasn't as much fun as Victor Sassoon probably would have liked. But he confronted Victor and he said to him, Victor, you are the richest man in town, and this is a crisis for our people, and you need to step forward. And much to his credit, Victor Sassoon did. He turned over many of the buildings that he owned and allowed refugees to stay there. He began to hire many of the refugees. He even at one point flew to South America to see if he could buy land that the Jews could be resettled in. But the most remarkable thing he did was he began to essentially work with the Japanese to protect these Jewish refugees. Japan at this point had invaded China. It had surrounded Shanghai. They hadn't invaded Shanghai yet because they didn't want to go to war with America just yet, or with Britain. But the Japanese were very anti-Semitic. But they also were fascinated by the Jews and by Victor Sassoon, who they thought was so wealthy and so influential, he might be able to keep the US out of the war, that he might be able to help Japan by keeping the West at bay, because they believed that Jews were so influential that they controlled the world economy and so forth. And so they named a Japanese captain, Inuzuka, who was an anti-Semite, to be in charge of this Jewish problem in Shanghai. And he began to meet with Victor Sassoon. And Victor Sassoon, I think, pulled one of the great con games of World War II. He poured on the charm and said to Captain Inuzuka, you should come to my nightclub, you should come to my hotel. Your soldiers are welcome here. And at the same time, he was having his workers spy on the Japanese to find out what they were talking about and what they were planning. And he sort of, played along. He said, oh, yes, I'll speak to Churchill and try to keep him out of the war. I have friends in Hollywood. They'll speak to Roosevelt and try to keep America out of the war. And all the time he was trying to keep the gates of Shanghai open and helping the Jews, giving them money, allowing them to sort of find, some foothold in Shanghai where they could support their families. And as a result, the gates of Shanghai stayed open, and 18,000 Jews were able to find refuge there. The Japanese finally caught on to what Victor was up to, and Victor had to flee. The Kadoories did not get out in time. The Kadoories had set up a school for these refugee children, where they hired many of the refugees who were teachers, and use them to sort of give the children some structure and to educate them. But they did not get out of Shanghai or Hong Kong in time. And when the Japanese invaded Shanghai, Pearl Harbor, on Pearl Harbor Day, the Kadoories were arrested, and Eli Kadoorie ultimately died in his own house. He was put under house arrest in the servants' quarters of his big mansion, Marble Hall, which I was able to visit. And he died there during the war. After the war, I think both the Kaduris and the Sassoons believed that things would return to normal, that they would be able to resume their businesses, their parties. But of course, as we know, that turned out not to be true. The communists quickly conquered China. They marched into Shanghai. Victor Sassoon left. He had a return ticket, but he never returned to Shanghai. And he lost almost everything because most of his wealth was in real estate, the hotels, the office buildings that he had built, the factories. And he ended up settling in the Bahamas and became quite bitter about China. And he once said, I didn't leave China, China left me. He acted almost like a scorned lover that China had turned its back on him. The Kaduris were smarter. The Kaduris had actually begun moving some of their money out of Shanghai to Hong Kong, even before the war. And when the war ended, Eli Kaduri had died, and so the business passed on to his two sons, Horace and Lawrence. And they decided to stay in Hong Kong because they believed that China would once again become a great power and, frankly, a great business opportunity. And over the next 50 years, they helped Hong Kong's dramatic growth. They were key in sort of the rebuilding of Hong Kong and the Hong Kong miracle. And today, the Kaduris are richer than ever. They're worth more than $13 billion. They meet regularly with the Chinese leadership. They have huge investments in China. They've met with Xi Jinping, the president. But I think, the family now is a little worried with the crackdown that's going on in Hong Kong, with the way things are tightening up, whether they're facing Shanghai all over again. Will they once again feel a need to flee as the communists kind of tighten their hold on Hong Kong? I'll stop there because I'm sure you have many questions and I'd love to hear your comments. So I'll turn it back to the rabbi to moderate our discussion.
Wow, thank you very much, Jonathan. That was captivating. Thank you so much for sharing that. So we'll have a question and answer. I see some questions coming in already. You could type in your questions, and if you raise your hand as well, where I see some people are raising their hands, David Nathaniel will be kind enough to unmute you, and you'll be able to ask your questions. So let me just start with the questions that already come in. We have a question from Lily Shore, and the question is, how many years did the Sassoons were involved in the opium trade? And if I could refine a little bit the question as well, or add to it, from what year to what year were they involved in the opium? And once it became illegal, did they stop immediately, or was it kind of like a time process where they, yeah.
Sure. Well, the opium trade was already going on when David Sassoon arrived in Bombay from Baghdad in the late 1820s, early 1830s. And so he sort of saw it as a business opportunity, and he began to sort of dabble in the opium trade in the early 1830s. But it was hard for him to get a foothold because he was still sort of a small businessman. You needed to have ships, you needed a lot of capital to succeed. So it was once opium was made legal was when he really began to make his move. So it was really from the 1830s up until the end of the opium trade, which wasn't until 1911, 1913. And I think what's interesting as we kind of look at and judge what the Sassoons did, as I mentioned, the Sassoons became very influential in London. They became members of the British government. They were very close to the royal family. They had a great deal of clout. And one of the things that you see, the British Parliament is debating whether to end the opium trade starting in the 1880s. It comes up all the time. It's like gun control in the US, right? It's always being discussed. It's always being defeated. And behind the scenes, the Sassoons were very influential in making it making it fail, in trying to stop the end of the opium trade. And finally, in 1911, 1913, when it's finally stopped, the Sassoons write these letters to the British government saying, well, who is going to compensate us for our losses? You know, who is going to make up for the losses now that we can no longer deal in opium? They did pretty much end it there. There was an illegal opium trade in Shanghai, but they didn't get involved in that. And Victor Sassoon's great genius was to basically use all the profits that they had made in opium and put it into real estate. And so a lot of the money that had been made in opium then went into building buildings and factories and so forth. And in that way, the fortune began to grow even more.
Okay, great. Thank you. We have another question from Joe Dabby from Los Angeles. What was the role of Ardoon in Shanghai?
Yeah, the Hardoons were the other great Baghdadi family that was in Shanghai. Hardoon, much like Eli Kaduri, came from Baghdad, worked for the Sassoons. He kind of worked almost as a night watchman and rent collector in the ports of Shanghai, collecting rents on the Sassoon properties and keeping an eye on them. While he was doing that, he met his wife, who was Eurasian. She was partially European, partially Chinese. The rumors are that she was a prostitute. We don't really know that, but they got married. And she, in a way, gave him an entree into the Chinese business world because she spoke Chinese. She knew many Chinese businessmen. And so he began to develop his fortune and eventually bought up a lot of the Sassoon properties, built his own empire, and by the mid-1930s was again one of the richest men in Shanghai. And he and his wife built this enormous mansion right in the middle of the city, surrounded by a park that was almost as big as Central Park in New York. It was massive. I visited there. What's a little quirky about the family is Hardoon obviously was Jewish. His wife was Buddhist. And so they adopted 12 children and raised 6 of them as Buddhists and 6 of them as Jews. And they became very involved in sort of Chinese imperial politics, but their family was not a terribly happy one. And in a way, this story is also about families and how do you preserve dynasties and preserve fortunes over the generations. When Hardoon died, his descendants, his children, went to war with each other. And there were all these lawsuits filed back and forth over his estate. And as a result, by the time World War II came, there was virtually no money left from this great fortune. There are still Hardoons around. Some live in Hong Kong, some live in London. But the vast fortune he built was just kind of tied up in court, and there's really not much sign of it today.
Great, thank you. We have a question from Odette Masliach. Is the story of the Sassoon and Kaduri helping the Jewish refugees and settle them in Shanghai included in the Holocaust documentation?
It's starting to be. I think actually it is one of the great, untold stories. What's interesting is that the Chinese have really embraced the story because when I first started visiting Shanghai, Shanghai is being redeveloped all the time and they're putting up all these tall skyscrapers. And the Jews mostly were kept in one part of Shanghai called Hangqiu. That was the neighborhood that I had visited where I saw the shadows of the mezuzahs. And the Japanese kept them there. It was called a ghetto, although the conditions weren't nearly as bad as the ghettos we read about in Poland or elsewhere. And there was a synagogue there, and there were many places where there were signs of when the refugees had lived there. When I first went to Shanghai in the 80s, the Shanghai was planning to just redevelop that whole area, tear it all down. It was ugly, it was poor, and put up skyscrapers. But the head of city planning for Shanghai told me, he said, you know, these businessmen keep on showing up saying, oh, my grandmother lived here, or my family started out here. And they realized that there was this tremendous interest in the Jewish refugee question. And so they've decided to preserve the area. They've turned part of it, including a synagogue, into a museum, a refugee museum, which is actually quite good. And then there are a number of places now where you can go where they've rebuilt tea houses and things like that that existed at the time. And so the Chinese, I think, are very interested in telling the story. What's interesting is that Victor Sassoon basically never talked about what he did. And I think in a way, it was kind of the man he was. He did step forward in an extraordinary way to help the Jewish refugees. But as soon as the war was over, he reverted to being, you know, Sir Victor Sassoon and going to the horse races and visiting with the Queen. He didn't really want to draw attention, I think, to his Jewish background and to what he had done. I think that was a conflict inside him. And so I would argue that I think both Elie Kaddouri and Victor Sassoon, you know, should be recognized individually for what they did, along with many of the Baghdadi families. And that's something that's interesting. Even the refugees themselves, when you spoke to them and read their memoirs, they didn't know who their benefactors were. One of them said to me, oh, we heard it was some family from Morocco. You know, that the Kaddouris and the Sassoons were so wealthy, they were so high up in Shanghai society, the fact that they were helping their fellow Jews who were in these desperate straits never quite reached down to them. Now, the one exception is the Kaddouri school was very successful. And a lot of the students who graduated that school remembered the Kaddouris. And a number of them settled in San Francisco. And in the 1970s, they arranged to have Horace Kaddouri, who had really run the school, who was an old man by then. I think he was 80, living in Hong Kong. They arranged to have him come to the US, where they honored him. And he was able to kind of sit there and see not only the students he had helped, but their children and their grandchildren. And I think that was an extraordinary moment for him. And I think something that meant a great deal.
Thank you. We have a question from Esther. Did they, I guess the Sassoon or the Kaddouri, build the Fullerton Hotel? Are they currently involved in the Chinese leadership?
I don't know about the Fullerton Hotel. The Kaddouris are quite close to the current Chinese leadership. I think that, you know, they were, when China decided to open up again in 1978, one of the first phone calls they made was to the Kaddouris, inviting them back. And it was interesting because, as I mentioned, Elie Kaddouri, the patriarch, had died in Japanese captivity, and his wife had died in a house fire in Shanghai. So they were actually both buried in the Jewish cemetery in Shanghai. During the Cultural Revolution, all the cemeteries in China were destroyed, ripped up. And the Kaddouris in Hong Kong never knew what had happened to their parents' graves. In 1978, when China opened up again, they invited Michael Kaddouri, who's now the head of the family, to visit Shanghai. And when he got there, they took him to what's essentially the National Cemetery. It's almost like Arlington National Cemetery. And there in the cemetery were two gravestones from the Kaddouris. Now, we don't know if they were the original gravestones that were saved or if they were reproductions, but it was clearly an effort that the Chinese were making to apologize for what had happened and to welcome the Kaddouris back. And that really started a renewed connection between the Kaddouris and the Chinese leadership. Michael Kaddouri has met every Chinese leader, including Xi Jinping. He met with Deng Xiaoping. He's met with all of them. But I think the dynamics have changed a little bit. You know, when the Kaddouris, like the Sassoons, were imperialists and colonialists, and Britain was on top, you know, the Chinese were kind of second class. Now, as China has become a superpower, I think the Kaddouris have to operate a little more carefully. And so, for example, they were involved in the negotiations that handed Hong Kong over to China. And in the recent crackdown that's gone on, the Kaddouris have been very careful about what they say. because they still have huge business interests in Hong Kong and in China. As I say, they're worth $13 billion, and probably half of that is tied to Hong Kong and China. So I think the Kaduris are, like any Western business now, are trying to figure out how they can get along with this new, more aggressive China that's developing.
Thank you, Jonathan. Robert Kaduri from New York. I think Jonathan just answered your question as well from the previous question. If there's anything else you want him to add, just type away. We have a question from Yvonne. As a young man, you saw the hotel in Shanghai and filed away the information. What was the catalyst years later that prompted you to retrieve the information and write the book?
That's a great question. You know, I think it was probably seeing those mezuzahs in Shanghai. You know, I think that I knew about the hotel. I knew about Marble Hall, where the Kaduris had lived. And again, this was, 43 rooms, and only 3 of them lived there. And they had over 40 servants. And I think when I saw the mezuzahs, I thought there's something here, that I had not known about the role of Jews in China at all. And I guess I'm always drawn a little bit to the way in which Jews have intersected with history, right? These families, I mean, we think of them as Jewish and we know their background, but they would be worth writing about no matter what they were, because they were so prominent, so influential, really helped bring China into the modern era. But the fact that they were Jewish, I guess it coalesced in my mind that these Jews kept on, facing history over and over again, facing these moral choices. And then seeing that the refugees had been there too, it's just kind of comes together, and you think there's got to be more here, and I want to find out about it.
Thank you. So we have a question from someone from Shar Shamaim. Question, I guess, was, who did Victor Sassoon leave his fortune to?
So Victor Sassoon, when he fled Shanghai, lost most of his money, but he still had, he was still relatively wealthy. He went to the Bahamas and ended up marrying his nurse. He was a playboy in China. He never married. He ended up marrying his nurse, who was from Dallas, Texas. And so some of the money went to her. He set up a foundation in the Bahamas for heart research. And then there were other Sassoon relatives in London who got some bequests. But he also had a network. He's a really interesting man. He had a network of women friends, some of whom he had affairs with, but others he also was just very close to. And he would buy them a house in New Mexico and things like that, the kind of things, wealthy people do sometimes. They sort of see themselves as patrons. But one thing that is interesting, because Victor ended up marrying somebody from Dallas, his papers, when he died, ended up going to Southern Methodist University Library in Dallas, Texas, kind of an odd place, all the way from Baghdad to end up there. And so I went there to go through his diaries and his papers, and I was in the middle of this university library going through Victor Sassoon's appointment diary for his business deals. And suddenly these nude pictures started falling out, pictures of all these nude women. And I was sort of embarrassed, because I thought the librarian might come over and say, "What are you bringing these nude pictures into our library?" Well, it turned out one of the ways Victor Sassoon met women is that he would meet them at his hotel or at his nightclub and invite them back to his studio, where he would take their nude pictures, and then have affairs with them. And he would keep the pictures in his business diary, along with his negotiations over acquiring the company or meetings with diplomats or whatever. And so I was opening these pages, all these years later, and out were falling these kind of nude pictures in the middle of Dallas. So that gave me a feel for what it was like to be Victor Sassoon in Shanghai.
That's great. That's fascinating. We have a question here from Shaul Ardoun. I hope I get this right. Regarding the Hardoon Garden. Mm-hmm. And regarding 1945 equals court, question mark.
Well, I'm not sure about the court part. So the Hardoon Garden was beautiful. As I said, it was the size of a city park. It was very elaborate, had some beautiful statuary and so forth. Hardoon owned a lot of property in Shanghai. And one of his tenants was Mao Zedong, Chairman Mao. When Mao was in Shanghai founding the Communist Party, I mean, Shanghai was fascinating this way. You had these wealthy Baghdadi capitalists like the Sassoons and the Kaduris and the Hardoons, but you also had the Communist Party, which was starting there, meeting in secret. And so Mao had come from the countryside and was staying in an apartment that was owned by Hardoon. So he was paying rent to Hardoon. Now, we don't know if they ever met. But what's interesting is when the communists conquered China, Mao's building, the building that he stayed in that belonged to Hardoon, is still there. You can still visit it. But he immediately ordered that Hardoon's mansion be bulldozed and be knocked down completely. And instead, on top of it, they built a kind of a terrible Soviet style monument to a Soviet-Chinese friendship, which is still there. It's got a different name now. So there is a kind of symbolism that you can stand in Mao's apartment and see where the Hardoons used to live, and on the spot where they used to have a mansion and a great garden. But now it's this, very ugly monstrosity that Mao had built. And I don't know if that was deliberately to make sure that people remembered who won the war, but it's certainly kind of ironic that it's Mao's little hovel that remains, and Hardoon's great mansion is just a memory.
Great. So we have a question from Grace Hillel. Are they still family members in Shanghai? And a question from Violette Esser. What are the Sassoon Empire now? I guess.
Sure. It's interesting. The Sassoons, as I said, were even David Sassoon, the patriarch, wanted them to become part of the British establishment, and they really did. The Sassoons are, they're wealthy, but they're nowhere near as wealthy as they were. I mean, Victor Sassoon was probably the 5th or 6th richest man in the world in the 1930s. And most of that was lost in Shanghai when the communists took over and everything was nationalized. The book just came out in London. And in Britain, the Sassoons are well known because they're part of the government. Siegfried Sassoon is a very famous poet there. They're great art collectors. So it's sort of like talking about the Rockefellers a little bit in Britain. They're a prominent family, but really well known now for their politics and their art collecting, not so much for business. The Kaduris, by contrast, have really surpassed the Sassoons in terms of their business and economic influence. They own the Peninsula Hotel chain, beautiful hotels all around the world. As I say, they have huge holdings in Hong Kong. They built a nuclear reactor in China. They're very important as kind of a business family. The other thing that's interesting is that the Sassoons never really got involved at all in Israel or in Zionism. Again, I think part of that was that because they really saw their primary identity as being British.
Great, thank you. So we have a question here from Jacques. Jacques, I believe Jonathan answered at least, there's like 5 questions here. I think he answered at least 3 of them. So I'll ask the 2 last ones. Did any of the Sassoon family go to Israel? Question mark. I don't know if you answered that, Jonathan. And last question from Jacques, relation of Sassoon with Moses Montefiore?
I don't know the second one. On the first one, a few of the Sassoons did end up going to Jerusalem. There are several Sassoons I interviewed in Jerusalem. One became a rabbi and maintained their Jewish ties. It is interesting, when David Sassoon sent his sons to London and they settled there, many of them filed wills, and I was able to read the wills that they filed. And they were very much, you can almost hear these men thundering, saying, if you marry someone who's not Jewish, if you marry someone not from Baghdad, you will be disinherited. That's forbidden. But as we know, what often happens is that as the Sassoons became more assimilated, some of them converted, some of them kind of drifted away from Judaism, or they became, liberal Jews, going to synagogue only occasionally. But what's interesting is that the British never forgot that they were Jewish. Over and over again, when you sort of read the British side of this story, you see how the Sassoons were kind of exotic figures to them and useful figures. At one point, Winston Churchill was friends with many of the Sassoons. And when the Prince of Wales becomes the King of England, Winston Churchill says to his wife, gee, I wonder if he's going to bring his Jews with him to Buckingham Palace. So there was this kind of social anti-Semitism, condescension that even the Sassoons, as wealthy and as prominent as they were, had to endure.
Thank you. So we have a comment and a question from Joe Samuels from Los Angeles. I'm deeply impressed with your deep knowledge of the history of Iraqi Jews. Have you ever thought of writing a book on the Jews of Iraq and their exodus during the 20th century?
No, it's a great topic. I don't think I have the language skills that I would need to be able to do it, but I think it's a great story. And as I said, I joked at the beginning where, so many of the Baghdadi Jews I met would talk about, their prominence and their pride in the Iraqi community. So I think there's a great book there, but I think probably someone else should do it who has better languages than I do. One thing that is interesting in terms of languages, the Sassoons, one way they were beating their competitors is that they did all their business in Judeo-Arabic, and no one else spoke Judeo-Arabic. And so in Shanghai, where it was so competitive, they were able to just use Judeo-Arabic among their workers who were from Baghdad and among the family, and no one else could spy on them. And they often refer to this as being a secret weapon they had, which is that if somebody was trying to spy on them and find out their business deals, they didn't speak Judeo-Arabic, and so they couldn't find out what was going on. I'd have to learn Judeo-Arabic, and I don't think I can.
Okay, honest answer. So we have a question from Lily Shore. Can you say something about Rachel Sassoon Beer?
Yeah, she's another one of these extraordinary women in the Sassoon family. Women were not. She was in the late 1900s, and she was raised in England. And but women were not allowed to go to school. They weren't really given an education. They were educated at home, taught to play the piano, and supposed to kind of stay in their beautiful home until a guy came along and married them and ushered them into society. But she was very independent, and she went to London. She became a nurse, but then she met and fell in love with a German financier who had converted from Judaism to become a Protestant. They fell in love. She converted to become a Protestant. And then as a wedding gift, her husband bought her a couple of newspapers. And so she was the editor of two major British newspapers, The Observer and The Times, at a time when women couldn't vote. And again, this is the pattern over and over again in these families. Everyone assumes the women will be figureheads, but they end up being extraordinary. She was quite liberal. She began writing editorials, advocating for the rights of women, advocating for the rights of workers. She also became very involved in the Dreyfus affair. One of her newspaper correspondents was able to expose some of the false accusations against Dreyfus. And before she published this, she wanted to meet the anti-Semitic colonel who was behind a lot of this. And so she insisted on meeting him, and he writes about the meeting, and he says, it's horrible. He says, this sallow-skinned, hook-nosed Jewess came to ask me questions about Dreyfus, but she decides that they're going to publish the story, and it becomes a key moment in Dreyfus's rehabilitation. Now, her husband ended up dying. He had had a series of affairs. He ended up dying. and she fell into a depression. There's some speculation that he also had infected her with syphilis from all his amorous affairs. But when she fell into a depression, the family basically, instead of getting her treatment, I mean, again, this was in the 1900s, they basically put her in a lunatic asylum. And she lives out her life. She's finally released, but she ends up living alone in her house and loses control of all the newspapers. So again, you see this pattern of women kind of achieving a great deal, but then the men and in some cases their own families turn against them.
I'm going to unmute Evelyn Shaheen.
Yeah, I have a question about the Alliance schools in Iraq. I remember once Laura Kaduri, he was about 40 years old, and he came to visit us, and they said he came from China. Could you emphasize the role of the Laura Kaduri in the Alliance schools?
Right.
Because
yeah, no, it was very important. Laura Kaduri spoke French as well as English, obviously. And she took a leading role in setting up those schools in Baghdad. She had been in communication with some of the women parents in Baghdad who were looking for places to send their daughters. And so she felt that Jewish girls too should get an education, but also other Iraqi girls. And so there's a whole bunch of correspondence, some of it in French, where Laura is very involved in talking about the curriculum and what should be taught. I mean, she was really a feminist ahead of her time, and then was able to get her family to support them. But I think it's a remarkable way in which she's able to see the role of girls in the development of both Iraq and in China.
Okay, there's Emil Cohen. I'm going to allow him to unmute himself now and speak.
Thank you. Absolutely riveting story. I must congratulate you on writing this book. I want to add that the Iraqi Jews owe their education really to the Sassoons and the Kaduris because of the Alliance. Alliance was established 1865, and the girls' school, which Evelyn was just talking about, was in 1894. And they also built many schools in the rest of Iraq. And there were the schools in Mosul, for example, were called by the name of Horace Kaduri and Lawrence Kaduri. And the other schools were called Rifqa Kaduri. And this was the one in Baghdad was Laura Kaduri School. Now this put us, because of the level of these schools, the Iraqi Jews had a high level of education and became the elite of the Iraqi society. And they were very constructive in the building of Iraq. Now that was appreciated later on, but at the time they were quite pivotal there.
Yeah, and one thing I want to add to that, because I think this was sort of a tradition in the Kaduri family, when the family flees Shanghai, when they flee communism and they end up in Hong Kong, which is a British colony, Horace and Lawrence Kaduri, the sons of the patriarch, decide that their father had made a mistake, that he had lived in such isolation, that they were so wealthy in Shanghai that they never saw communism coming, they never saw the inequality, and that they had made a mistake and really lost almost everything because they didn't realize how the Chinese were responding. And so as a result, and I think part of it is also their mother's influence passed down, the Kaduris in Hong Kong decide to help Chinese refugees. And so there are a lot of Chinese peasants who are fleeing communist China in 1949, 1950, and onward. And the Kaduris, besides building up their businesses, get very involved in philanthropy in Hong Kong. And one of the things they do is they begin to buy up plots of land that they can give to these Chinese peasants who can then grow vegetables and raise pigs and, make some money to become, successful and to support their families. And the Kaduris also support research, agricultural research, and research into pigs, because pork is a staple of the Chinese diet, as we know, and they support all this research that allows pigs to get fatter and to be more efficient, so you can have more food and you can make more money when you bring them to market. And as a result, I think more than 300,000 Chinese refugees are helped by the Kaduris in this way. And the Chinese have this saying where they go around and they say, the Kaduris know everything about pigs except what they taste like. Because obviously they're keeping kosher. But it's sort of an interesting way in which, as in Iraq, they invest in things that end up bettering the whole society.
Thank you so much. We're getting so many comments saying how this presentation is incredible. We have even a participant that kindly said, I'm willing to translate for you Judeo-Arabic or Arabic and Hebrew. One last question and we'll wrap it up, is from Emil Shiri. What lessons does your research show about the succession of family businesses for future generations?
Oh, that's a great question. It's a tough one. It's interesting. So the Sassoons, as I said, David Sassoon had 8 sons, and he let them go. They went around the world. He let them go to China. He let them go to London, and soon after he died, the brothers all fell into a rivalry and they all started battling each other. Some of them left the family and started their own businesses. Others remained close. And so it's interesting that you can be kind of someone who's trying to help your children, but how do you keep them close? The Kaduris, by contrast, Eli Kaduri keeps a very tight rein on his family. When his wife dies, he basically makes his sons stay with him. They want to study in London. He brings them back to Shanghai, sort of like Donald Trump, maybe, makes them work for his company. And they really are in his shadow. And now the Kaduris are, trying to pass it on to their children as well by bringing them into the business. I guess I think I'm not wealthy enough to have a family fortune to pass on, but I think there is a way in which family loyalty ends up being very important. That if you believe that the family is more important than the business, then the family stays together. But if you believe business is more important than family, it feels like you're more likely to scatter, keep the name, but maybe not the family ties.
Thank you so much, Jonathan, for very informative answers. That was great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, thank you, Jonathan. Your last comment I thought was very profound in the question of, does family come before business or business before family? And I certainly hope it's family before business, although we can see that often is not the case. I do want to mention that it is unfortunate that the Jews are no longer in Iraq, in Babylon, and there are a lot of people who are working today to share the history, to bring the sort of the forced exodus to the forefront. We have Lynn Julius and her book Uprooted. We have Sephardi Voices that have recorded testimonies of many different Iraqi Jews. We have, as I mentioned, the Babylonian Museum in Israel. And and right now, a very pressing matter are the Jewish archives that the US military were able to recover and were brought back to the US and restored, and the Iraqi government is demanding their return. And so so there's a lot of effort. Carol Basri would be one that's been leading this effort, and others to try to stop those archives from going back. So I will I'm just going to share my screen for 2 seconds as we're going to conclude this presentation. So once again, I'd like to thank Rabbi Pinto, Charles Shemy, the Spanish-Portuguese Synagogue in Montreal, and all our co-sponsors again, and you can see their names up on the screen. And I would like to again thank Jonathan. Wow, you are unbelievable. I personally enjoyed your talk and all your ability to answer all these questions, very much so. And it's really a pleasure to have you, and I wish you the best of success as you move forward. Again, Jonathan's book, The Last Kings of Shanghai, is available online, Amazon, and other book resellers. And we wish you a wonderful morning, afternoon, evening, depending where you are. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you very much.